The most dangerous mistake a powerful man can make is assuming he has already seen everything worth noticing. Jonathan Blake had built his empire on precision, on never missing details, on reading numbers the way others read faces. Yet tonight, in a private dining room overlooking Manhattan's skyline, he didn't even look up when the waitress set down his coffee, the steam rising between them like something quietly alive, unnoticed, irrelevant, just like her. And if you've ever wondered how often we miss the moment that changes everything, you might want to remember this one, because it didn't begin with a grand entrance or a dramatic reveal. It began with silence, the kind that hides truth in plain sight. Her name was Emily Carter, though no one here used it. To them she was just another server in a black apron, moving between tables with calm, efficient steps, her posture straight, her expression neutral, the kind of presence people forgot the second she walked away. But there was something different in the way she placed the cup, not rushed, not careless, exact, like she understood weight, balance, consequence. Jonathan, meanwhile, was already halfway through a $120,000 contract discussion, his voice low, controlled, the kind of tone that made executives lean in and listen, his $40,000 watch catching the light as he signed initial after initial, never once acknowledging the woman standing less than 2 feet away, because in his world, people like her didn't exist beyond service, beyond function. The city stretched below in gold and glass, 12 stories down, cars moving like quiet currents, while inside, decisions were being made that could shift millions of dollars in seconds, and Emily stood there for just a moment longer than necessary, not waiting, not hesitating, just observing, her eyes briefly scanning the document on the table before she turned away, as if it meant nothing, as if he meant nothing. Minutes passed, conversation continued, laughter rose and fell, until Jonathan reached for the receipt at the end of the meal, barely glancing as he prepared to sign. But then, his pen stopped, just for a fraction of a second, because beneath the total, written in clean, precise handwriting, was a single line that didn't belong, a sentence that felt like a memory forcing its way back to the surface. Clause 14 is still risky. The room didn't change, the voices didn't stop, but something inside him did, something subtle, something sharp, like a thread being pulled loose from a perfectly tailored suit, and for the first time that night, Jonathan Blake looked up. Jonathan Blake did not move right away, but his fingers tightened slightly around the pen as if the ink itself had turned heavier, and for a man who had spent the last decade controlling outcomes down to the smallest decimal point, that single handwritten sentence felt like something slipping beyond his control, quiet but undeniable, and he read it again, slower this time, not because he did not understand the words, but because he recognized them, not just the meaning, but the pattern, the precision, the exact way the letters curved with disciplined restraint, a style he had seen only once before, 5 years ago, on a report that had arrived anonymously at 3 in the morning, just hours before his company was about to finalize a deal that would have quietly destroyed everything he had built. Back then, no one had caught the flaw, not his legal team, not his analysts, not even Jonathan himself, until that report appeared, and signed, untraceable, but impossibly accurate, pointing out a hidden risk buried deep inside Clause 14, a detail so subtle it had nearly cost him $200 million and his entire reputation, and he had spent months trying to find the person behind it, offering rewards, launching internal investigations, even hiring private consultants, but whoever it was, had vanished without leaving a single trace, as if they had never existed at all. And now, sitting in a quiet restaurant with a half-finished glass of water and a cooling cup of coffee, Jonathan felt that same presence again, not loud, not demanding recognition, but precise, calm, and impossible to ignore. He slowly lifted his gaze, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the careful control of a man who understood that some moments, once acknowledged, could not be undone, and across the room, Emily Carter moved between tables with the same steady rhythm, her expression unchanged, her focus on a customer asking for extra napkins, her voice soft, professional, entirely ordinary, as if she had not just reached across time and placed a question directly in front of him. Jonathan watched her now, really watched, noticing things he had dismissed before, the way she listened without interrupting, the way she adjusted a glass by half an inch so it aligned perfectly with the edge of the table. The way her eyes seemed to register more than she allowed herself to show. And something inside him, something rare and unfamiliar, began to form, not certainty, not yet, but curiosity edged with unease. Because powerful men like Jonathan Blake were used to being recognized first, not the other way around. And yet here he was, holding a receipt that felt less like a bill and more like a message, a quiet reminder that someone in this room had seen him long before he ever noticed her. And the question that followed was not who she was, but why she had chosen to remain invisible until now. Emily Carter had learned a long time ago that the less people noticed you, the more you could see, and tonight was no different, because while the room revolved around Jonathan Blake and the quiet gravity of his decisions, she moved through it like someone who had already measured every variable, every tone, every shift in energy, without needing to be acknowledged for it. And that was not something you learned from carrying plates or memorizing orders. That came from a different life. One that required attention to detail so precise that a single overlooked line could change everything. 5 years earlier, she had been sitting in a narrow apartment no bigger than 600 square feet, a laptop balanced on a worn wooden table, scanning through documents she was never meant to see, contracts layered with language designed to confuse rather than clarify. And she had noticed it almost instantly, not because she was looking for it, but because she could not ignore it, the imbalance hidden inside Clause 14. A risk so carefully disguised it felt intentional, and for a moment she had hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of understanding, because stepping in meant stepping into a world that did not welcome people like her, a world where credit was claimed by those with titles and influence, not by someone working quietly in the background. She had sent the report anyway, anonymously, not expecting anything in return, not even acknowledgement, just a simple correction placed into the right hands at the right time. And when the deal collapsed and Jonathan Blake's company avoided what would have been a catastrophic mistake, she had already moved on, closing the laptop, turning off the light, choosing silence over recognition. That choice had not been weakness, it had been clarity, because Emily understood something most people did not. That power was not always about being seen. Sometimes it was about knowing you could step away and leave the outcome behind. Now, years later, she stood in a restaurant where a single meal could cost more than a month of rent, adjusting silverware and refilling glasses, her life reduced to something simple on the surface, but not small, never small, because every movement still carried that same precision, that same awareness. And when she had written that sentence on the receipt, she had not done it to reveal herself, she had done it because the pattern was there again. The same flaw, the same risk, and ignoring it would have meant ignoring who she was. Across the room, Jonathan was still watching her, though he tried not to make it obvious, his mind working through possibilities, logic pushing against something less comfortable. Because if she was the one, if the quiet waitress moving between tables was the same person who had once altered the course of his entire company, then everything about how he understood status, intelligence, even success, would need to be recalculated. And for the first time in years, Jonathan Blake was not thinking about numbers. He was thinking about a person he had already dismissed, and that realization sat heavier than any deal he had ever signed. Jonathan Blake did something he rarely did in public. He waited, not for a deal to close or a number to confirm, but for a moment. And when Emily returned to his table to refill his glass, he did not look at his phone. He did not continue his conversation. He simply said, quietly, almost carefully, "Where did you learn to read contracts like that?" And the question hung between them, not loud, not aggressive, but precise, like he was testing a theory he was not ready to admit. Emily paused for the smallest fraction of a second, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for him to see that she understood exactly what he was asking. Not about the receipt, not really, but about something deeper, something older. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, professional, untouched by the tension he was beginning to feel. "I read what is written, sir," she said, placing the water down with the same quiet control, "and sometimes what is not." It was not a direct answer, and that was exactly why it unsettled him, because most people, when confronted by someone like Jonathan Blake, rush to explain themselves, to prove their worth, to be seen. But she did not. She stood there with nothing to prove, and that absence of need created a space he did not know how to fill. He studied her now without hiding it. The way her posture remained relaxed but precise. The way her eyes met his without challenge yet without submission. And for the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar press against his certainty. Not doubt, not weakness, but curiosity sharpened into something closer to respect. "You wrote that," he said, lifting the receipt slightly, not accusing, not questioning, simply stating what he was beginning to believe, and Emily glanced at it briefly, her expression unchanged, as if it were nothing more than a simple note. "I wrote what you might have missed," she replied, and there it was, not arrogance, not defiance, just truth, delivered without decoration. Around them, the room continued as if nothing had shifted. Glasses clinked softly. A server laughed somewhere near the bar. The city lights outside flickered in steady patterns. But at that table, something had tilted, subtle but irreversible. Because Jonathan Blake was no longer speaking to someone invisible. He was speaking to someone who had already seen through him once before. He leaned back slightly, not to distance himself, but to create space to think, to recalibrate. Because if she was who he believed she was, then this was not a coincidence. It was a convergence, a moment where past and present aligned without warning, and he had built his entire life on recognizing patterns before they became problems. 5 years ago, he began, his voice lower now, controlled but carrying a weight it had not held earlier. "Someone sent me a report that saved my company from a very expensive mistake." And for the first time, Emily did not immediately respond. She simply held his gaze, not confirming, not denying, and that silence said more than any answer could have. Jonathan exhaled slowly, the realization settling in layers, because this was not just about a contract or a clause. It was about a person he had overlooked twice, once in the past and once just minutes ago, and both times, she had been the one holding the truth. "Why stay invisible?" he asked finally, the question quieter than before, almost personal now, and Emily tilted her head slightly, as if considering not the question, but whether it deserved an answer. "Because," she said softly, "being seen is not always the same as being understood." And then she stepped back, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to return to her role, leaving Jonathan with something far more disruptive than any business risk, a question he could not immediately solve. And for a man like him, that was the beginning of everything. The shift happened so quietly that no one else in the room noticed. But for Jonathan Blake, it felt like the ground beneath his certainty had just moved half an inch to the left, just enough to make everything feel slightly off balance. Because as Emily stepped away, returning to another table with the same composed rhythm, his phone buzzed against the table, a sharp, modern interruption that pulled him back into the world he understood. Numbers, urgency, control, and he glanced down, expecting routine confirmation, a finalized clause, a green light. But instead the message was short, precise, and deeply wrong. "We have an issue with Clause 14. Legal is flagging it now. Potential exposure 200 million. Jonathan did not react outwardly. His face remained still, his posture unchanged, but his eyes flickered once, just once, as the timing aligned too perfectly to ignore, because the deal he had been seconds away from signing was now echoing the same flaw from 5 years ago, the same hidden risk, the same blind spot. Except this time, the warning had not come from his team. It had come from a waitress he had nearly dismissed without a second thought. He slowly placed the pen down, not because he had decided anything yet, but because the act of signing suddenly felt premature, and across from him, his partners continued speaking, unaware that the conversation had already shifted in his mind, from negotiation to verification, from confidence to calculation, and Jonathan leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting again toward Emily, who was now helping an older man adjust his chair with a quiet patience that did not match the complexity of what she had just done. "Excuse me," Jonathan said, his voice calm but carrying enough weight to pause the table, and he stood, not abruptly, but with intention, as if stepping out of one version of the evening and into another, one that no longer followed the script he had arrived with. He walked across the room, not fast, not slow, each step measured, until he reached her just as she finished with the customer. And when she turned, there was no surprise in her expression, no curiosity, just that same steady awareness, as if she had known this moment would come the second she wrote that line. "If you saw it," he said quietly, holding her gaze now without pretense, "then you also know what happens if I ignore it." And this time, there was no title in his voice, no distance, just a question that acknowledged her as something more than the role she was playing. Emily glanced briefly toward his table, then back at him, her eyes clear, unhurried. "You already know the answer," she replied, and it was not dismissive, it was not instructive, it was simply accurate, and that was what made it impossible to argue with. Jonathan exhaled slowly, a decision forming not from pressure, but from recognition, because for the second time in his life, the same person had quietly placed the truth in front of him, and the cost of ignoring it was no longer theoretical, it was immediate, measurable, real. Behind him, his partners were beginning to notice his absence, their conversation faltering, confusion replacing momentum, and Jonathan turned back toward them. But this time, when he picked up the contract, he did not sit down. He stood there, looking at the page, at the line that now carried more weight than the entire agreement. And for the first time that night, the most powerful man in the room hesitated, not because he was unsure of the numbers, but because he was finally certain about something else entirely, that the person he had overlooked was now the only reason he could see clearly at all. Jonathan did not sit down again, and that alone was enough to fracture the rhythm of the table, because men at his level did not hesitate in front of contracts. They executed, they closed, they moved on, and yet here he stood, the paper, still in his hand, the city lights reflecting faintly across its surface, while his partners exchanged glances that carried the first signs of concern, subtle but growing, because uncertainty at the top had a way of spreading faster than any market shift. "Is there a problem?" one of them finally asked, his tone controlled but edged with impatience. And Jonathan did not answer right away, not because he did not know what to say, but because he was measuring something far less visible than numbers, something that could not be projected on a screen or summarized in a report, and that realization pressed against everything he had built his identity on. "There might be," he said at last, his voice calm, but no longer automatic, no longer flowing from habit, and he placed the contract back on the table without signing it. That was the moment the room truly changed. Conversations nearby softened, not because people heard the words, but because they sensed the shift, the way energy tilts when control is no longer absolute. And Jonathan's partners leaned forward now, their attention sharpened, because a delay like this did not come without consequence. "We have reviewed this deal 3 times, another man said, more firmly. Legal cleared every clause. And Jonathan's gaze flickered briefly to the line that now carried a weight no one else at the table could see. Clause 14, a detail buried in language that appeared safe until someone who understood patterns looked closer. "Legal missed something," Jonathan replied, not raising his voice, not defending, simply stating, and the words landed heavier than any argument, because they introduced doubt where certainty had been assumed. Across the room, Emily continued working, but she was aware now, not watching directly, but sensing the shift the way someone attuned to detail always could, the slight tightening of voices, the pause between decisions, the invisible moment where a path begins to change direction, and she did not move toward it. She did not intervene again, because she had already done what needed to be done. The choice now belonged to him. Jonathan picked up his phone, scrolling through the message again, the confirmation from his legal team, now echoing what she had written minutes earlier, and for a brief second, something unfamiliar surfaced beneath his control, not fear, but exposure, the awareness that his position, his authority, his reputation for precision had all just been challenged by someone the system itself would never recognize. And if you have ever seen someone who built their life on being right face the possibility that they were not, then you understand how quiet that moment can feel, how heavy. "Delay the signing," Jonathan said, his tone final now, and the reaction was immediate, objections rising, concerns about timing, about perception, about opportunity cost measured in millions, but he did not argue, he did not justify, because for the first time in this room, he was not responding to pressure, he was responding to truth, and that difference made him still, grounded in a way that surprised even him. His eyes moved again, almost instinctively, toward Emily, who was now placing a dessert in front of another table, her expression unchanged, her presence steady, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, and that contrast between the quiet certainty of her actions and the growing tension around him settled something deeper inside Jonathan, something that did not need to be explained. Fix clause 14, he added, more quietly this time, and as the room adjusted, as phones were lifted and calls were made, as the momentum of the deal fractured into fragments of urgency, Jonathan remained standing, not at the center of power as he had always been, but at the edge of a realization he could not ignore, that sometimes the most important voice in the room is the one no one thought to listen to. And if you were sitting there watching this unfold, you might find yourself wondering the same thing he was now asking without words. How many times had he already walked past the truth simply because it did not look like it belonged to him? It is often the smallest details that refuse to stay buried, and once noticed, they begin to connect in ways that are impossible to ignore. Because as the tension around the table shifted into controlled urgency, Jonathan Blake's attention was no longer on the contract alone. It was on the pattern, the repetition, the quiet precision that had now appeared twice in his life under circumstances that should have had no connection at all. He moved slightly away from the table, not to escape the discussion, but to observe it from a different angle, his mind replaying not just the sentence on the receipt, but everything that had followed, the timing of the message from legal, the exact phrasing Emily had used, and something deeper that did not fit neatly into logic, because this was no longer coincidence, it was alignment. Across the room, Emily continued as if nothing had shifted, but if someone had been watching closely enough, they might have noticed the subtle difference in how she moved now. Not slower, not faster, but more deliberate, as if she had already calculated the outcome of a situation she would not directly control, and that kind of detachment did not come from ordinary experience. Jonathan's phone buzzed again, this time with a detailed breakdown from his legal team, confirming the exposure, the exact same structural flaw hidden in updated language, and he felt a quiet realization settle in, not sharp, not dramatic, but steady, that she had not just noticed the problem, she had anticipated it before his entire team could verify it. He looked up again, his gaze narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, because now he was no longer asking if she was the same person from 5 years ago. He was asking something far more unsettling. How long had she been able to see things like this? And how many times had she chosen not to act? One of his partners approached him, voice lowered, controlled. "We can adjust the clause and proceed tonight, but we need to move quickly." And Jonathan nodded. But his attention drifted again, because something about that option felt incomplete, as if fixing the clause addressed the symptom, not the pattern behind it. Meanwhile, Emily passed by his table again, carrying a tray with effortless balance, and as she set down a dessert for another guest, the man thanked her casually, barely looking up, and she responded with a soft smile, the kind that did not linger, the kind that did not invite further attention. And yet Jonathan noticed something in that moment that had not been obvious before, a ring on her finger, simple, unadorned, not decorative, but intentional, and the way she adjusted it slightly as she turned suggested habit, not vanity, and for reasons he could not immediately explain, that detail stayed with him longer than it should have. Because people who lived quietly did not usually carry themselves with that level of awareness, that level of control, and it raised a question that did not yet have an answer. What had she walked away from to end up here? He stepped closer again, not interrupting, not demanding, just positioning himself within her field of awareness. And when she finished with the table, she glanced at him briefly, not surprised, not curious, just acknowledging. And in that moment, it felt less like he was observing her and more like she had already accounted for him long before he chose to pay attention. "You saw it before anyone else," he said quietly, not as a question, but as a realization, and Emily tilted her head slightly, considering him for a second that stretched just long enough to feel deliberate. "Sometimes," she replied. "It is easier to see when you are not trying to own the outcome." And that answer, simple on the surface, carried a depth that suggested this was not the first time she had made that choice. Jonathan held her gaze, the noise of the room fading again into the background, because now the situation was no longer about a contract. It was about a truth that had been present all along, waiting for him to notice it. And if you were watching this unfold, you might start to wonder the same thing he was beginning to understand, that the real story here was not why she was working as a waitress, but why someone with that level of clarity had chosen to remain unseen for so long. The truth did not arrive like a revelation. It unfolded quietly, piece by piece, until it could no longer be ignored, and Jonathan Blake realized that the question he had been asking was not the right one, because it was not about how she saw what others missed. It was about why she had chosen to stay where no one was looking at all. He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to remove the distance that had existed between them since the beginning of the night. "You walked away from it," he said, not asking anymore, but tracing the outline of something he was beginning to understand. And for the first time, Emily did not immediately respond, her gaze shifting briefly past him, not to avoid the question, but to consider whether the answer would change anything. Around them, the room continued in controlled motion, contracts being revised, conversations recalibrated. But here, in this small space between two people, something far more significant was taking shape. "I did not walk away," she said finally, her voice calm, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. "I finished what I was supposed to do." The distinction was subtle, but it changed everything. Jonathan frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition that there was more beneath the surface than he had accounted for. And Emily continued, not explaining, not defending, just revealing what he was now ready to hear. "That report 5 years ago was not a favor," she said. "It was part of my work." The words settled between them, and for a moment, Jonathan's mind moved through possibilities that did not fit his previous assumptions. Because if it had been her work, then she had not been a random observer. She had been placed there, positioned, intentional. "What kind of work?" he asked quietly. And this time, there was no hesitation at all. "Risk analysis," she replied. And then, after the smallest pause, "Independent, off-record, the kind companies hire when they do not want problems to exist in the first place." Jonathan felt something shift again, not outside, but internally, because this was not just intelligence. This was expertise, trained, refined, chosen, and suddenly the past began to realign with the present in a way that felt almost inevitable. "You were hired to review that deal," he said, connecting the pieces now, and Emily nodded once, a simple acknowledgement. "Through a third party," she added. "Your company never knew." The realization landed with a quiet force, because it meant that the most critical intervention in his company's history had come from someone he had never met, never thanked, never even known existed. And now she was standing in front of him, not as a consultant, not as an advisor, but as someone the world would pass by without a second thought. "Then why are you here?" he asked. And this time, the question carried no assumption, only curiosity, because the answer no longer felt obvious. Emily glanced down briefly, her fingers brushing lightly against the simple ring on her hand, and when she looked back up, there was something different in her expression, not vulnerability, but truth without distance. "Because the work ended," she said, "and I chose something else." Jonathan held her gaze, the simplicity of the answer contrasting with the complexity of everything it implied, and for the first time, he understood that this was not a story about someone who had lost their place. It was about someone who had left it on purpose. And if you were watching this moment unfold, you might begin to question the same thing he was now facing in silence. What kind of person walks away from power not because they have to, but because they no longer need it? Jonathan Blake stood there a moment longer than necessary, not because he needed more information, but because for the first time in years, he did not feel the need to control what came next, and that realization settled into him with a quiet weight that no boardroom victory had ever carried, because everything about this night had shifted in a direction he could not have predicted, not by numbers, not by strategy, but by a single choice made by someone who no longer measured her value by outcomes he once believed defined everything. Behind him, his team continued adjusting the contract, voices steady again, the deal salvaged, the risk contained, the world returning to its familiar rhythm of calculation and control. But Jonathan did not immediately return to the table. Instead, his attention remained on Emily, who had already moved on, already stepped back into the quiet flow of her work as if nothing significant had occurred, as if she had not just altered the course of a $200 million decision with a single Handwritten line. You could have said nothing, he said finally, his voice softer now, not questioning her ability, but acknowledging her choice, and Emily met his gaze without hesitation. I could have, she replied. But then you would have made the same mistake twice. There was no judgment in her tone, no criticism, just a simple truth delivered without weight. And Jonathan let out a small breath, something close to a quiet laugh, not because it was amusing, but because it was accurate in a way that left no room for argument. He glanced briefly at the contract again, then back at her, and for the first time that night, he did not see a waitress. He saw someone who had already walked through the world he dominated and chosen to leave it behind, not out of failure, but out of understanding. Most people would have stayed, he said, more to himself than to her, and Emily's expression softened just slightly, not in agreement, but in recognition of the thought. Most people think staying is the same as winning, she answered. It is not. The words lingered between them, quiet but complete, and Jonathan realized that everything he had built, every deal, every calculated risk, every victory measured in dollars and growth, had never once asked him the question she had just answered so easily. What was enough? Across the room, someone called her name. Another table needing attention, another moment that would pass unnoticed by most. And Emily gave a small nod, not as permission, not as farewell, but as acknowledgement, before turning away, her steps steady, her presence once again blending into the background of a world that would never fully understand what it had just witnessed. Jonathan watched her go, not with urgency, not with regret, but with a clarity that felt unfamiliar and yet entirely certain, because for the first time in a long time, he understood that power was not always about being seen at the top of the room. Sometimes it was about knowing you could leave it entirely and still remain exactly who you were. He returned to the table then, the contract now revised, the risk removed, the deal ready once more. And when he signed this time, his hand did not hesitate, not because everything was the same, but because something inside him had changed, something quieter, something deeper, something that would not show up in reports or earnings, but would remain long after the numbers had been forgotten. And somewhere across the room, unnoticed by most, Emily Carter placed another cup of coffee down with the same calm precision. Her work simple, her presence quiet, her impact invisible to those who were not paying attention. And that was exactly how she had chosen it to be, because some people do not need the world to recognize their power, they only need to know they never lost it.